Welcome to Confessions in Quarantine, our sixth episode. Today we're going over the sixth commandment: Thou shalt not commit adultery. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. Full disclosure, I don't really like talking about sex all that much, and that's kind of a weak point for discussing a commandment like this one. I've heard way too many pastors say weird things that make me feel uncomfortable, so I'm gonna try to, be a little bit careful with this one. Beyond that, I'm a white dude in my 30s. What this means is that the consequences for disobeying this commandment generally seldom affect me as much, historically speaking, as much as they've affected women. So when you're trying to really figure out what this commandment means for us in our daily lives, yeah, I've got something to say, but it would also do you well to look at what following this commandment means from feminist, from womanist, and from mujerista theological perspectives. So with all of that said, let's start digging into the confessions. So, in dealing with our handy-dandy Book of Concord, let's see what the sixth commandment says to us. You are not to commit adultery. What is this? Answer. We are to fear and love God so that we lead pure and decent lives in word and deed, and each of us loves and honors his or her spouse. Usually, adultery means a person who is married having sex with someone to whom they are not married. But when we look through the scriptures and when we look through the works of the reformers, when we look through the Book of Concord, we find that the commandment is a little bit more in-depth than that. Jesus is usually the first one who makes us modify our understanding of this commandment. When he says that committing adultery isn't just the act of having sex with someone you're not married to, as a married person, but rather Jesus teaches us that anyone who looks upon another with lust in their hearts is actually committing adultery. Jesus actually goes on a little bit further and says that if you look upon a woman and that woman causes you to stumble, it would be better for you to pluck your eye out. He doesn't actually challenge the woman, which is very important for feminist theologians, but he says that that change has to be internal. As time went on and as society went on from the Old Testament and New Testament periods, we find that culture around sexuality changes a little bit, and that means that our understanding of the commandment also has to change a little bit. As the cultures change, obedience to an extent changes. The heart is still there. The command is still there, but what that means in a context can subtly and importantly differ. Martin Luther actually kind of starts us down this path to an extent. Luther believed that in the period of Moses, when the commandment was first written down, that men and women were actually expected to marry at a much younger age than in his period. Luther expected for people in Moses' period to marry very young indeed. And by extension, sex work was considered to be very, very sinful in that period and culturally almost not happening. Because sex work was generally not happening, most of the illicit sex that was going on was adultery. Luther believed that Bronze Age Jewish sexuality practices were a good deal more ethical than those of his contemporary Germany because there was just more marriage in his time. But because that was the problem, because he thought that sex work was generally not happening, he also thought that meant adultery was the real thing that Moses had to talk about. Reformation Germany, however, had its own problems, which in turn Luther had to start addressing. But before we even get into that address, we need to understand something very important about Luther's background understanding of human sexuality, because he was in a medieval Roman Catholic context. And here's what that means. Understand that this is the background for what Luther is thinking before he says anything. First off, he is in rebellion against a general understanding of sexuality that valued celibacy over sex and celibacy over the office of marriage. He was living in a background in which marriage was forbidden for priests, and priests were thought to be more holy than lay people. That is, chastity and not being married, celibacy, is up here, and married folks and sexually active folks are just going to be down here at the best of days. Because Luther believed that the entire concept of, an echelon system, a tier system for human sinfulness and human graciousness, human obedience to the law, because Luther, kind of threw that entire idea out the window, through justification by grace through faith, all of a sudden, he had to throw a lot of that whole baggage around sexuality out of the window too. Not only was priesthood no longer considered superior to married and daily life, but also celibacy was no longer valued above sexual practice. And beyond that as well, a prohibition against priestly marriage also went away. It's also really worth noting that clerical celibacy in Luther's period was more of an ideal than a real practice. In Luther's period, we have to understand that clerical marriage had been really formally outlawed for only about 500 or so years. However, among monastic and priestly figures, there actually was still sexual practice. It was just through sex workers and through adultery. And in this case, that meant sometimes monks would impregnate sex workers who had no real legal standing and no real financial support from the fathers of their children. And the issue for us today is also that the priests were kind of using these people as a means to an end, as a means to their own gratification, which, as you recall from Luther's entire understanding of authority, isn't right. So in contrast to this background of clerical celibacy, Luther instead focused on the value of human marriage and the value of human sexuality. And in doing so, he broadened his understanding of the commandment, believing it to focus instead not just on adultery, but on what he described as unchastity. Unchastity is viewed in contrast with what Luther understood to be a healthy and a happy marriage, one in which husband and wife were really partners, as opposed to alternate side objectifiers. In so doing, Luther lifts up the concept of a loving and supportive marriage, and marriage is a way of life that has a lot more to do with the nature of community, of authority, of parenthood, and thus bringing us in line with all of the preceding commandments. Sex isn't bad for Luther, but if you like sex, you should try marriage. So unchastity, of course, has sexual components. Don't cheat on your spouse. Don't do it. Just don't. But it has a lot of other components as well. To obey this commandment means to live a life that honors and loves your spouse. I mean, you all know what a happy and healthy marriage is. It's founded on love and respect and looking out for one another and not demeaning one another. It's like the exact opposite of pretty much every marriage you see on TV. But if a God-pleasing marriage is founded upon love and respect, then we actually discover that the concept of adultery means a lot more than sexual infidelity. The theologian Dorothy Sola begins her book Suffering with an examination and a critique of a concept she entitles Christian masochism. Christian masochism occurs, to Sola, when someone puts their wholeness and humanity below another in an attempt to be obedient towards God. This, we should know, is in stark contrast to what Jesus describes as freedom and liberation. And her primary illustration of this is actually through an illustration on a disobedience to the sixth commandment, a case of adultery. Sola brings up the story of a friend of hers from Bavaria who was living in a small village in Bavaria with 3 children and an abusive husband. The husband, Sola described as weak, as short, as dumb, but also superbly evil, and used all of his capacities and all of his abilities to harm and really destroy his wife. This is happening in the context of a small provincial village in Bavaria, a very Roman Catholic region of Germany in the 60s and in the 70s, a place where divorce was pretty much unheard of, and neither the state, nor the village, nor even her family would protect her or her children from this husband. Because, after all, the husband keeps saying that he's gonna do better, but he's not gonna do better. The woman, in this case, is expected to continue to be with the husband and to say that this suffering is just her cross to bear. Christian masochism. So tell me, if the woman were to divorce and remarry, would she be committing adultery? In the past, the church would have almost unanimously said that she would be committing adultery if she left her husband and then went on to remarry. The Gospels themselves, when understood in a very particular way, a way that limits the concept of adultery just to sexual infidelity, would also make that case. That's how the church has normally understood this. But again, we're realizing that we are limiting the idea of adultery in this case. We're limiting adultery to the realm of sexuality. And I suspect this is a very limited view and not necessarily the most faithful one. The unfaithfulness in this case is on the husband's part, because he's the one who is living a life that's centered upon himself and not a life that's centered on love and service and freedom. It seems centered on his abuse and self-image, not on honoring his spouse. If you're not obeying the commandment, you're breaking it. Such a marriage, you could well argue, is actually theologically invalid, because it's not a marriage that's being lived in marriage, but a marriage that's being lived in abuse, in dishonor, in shame, and in scorn. The marriage seems hell-bent on the destruction of the one by the other. And that ain't what it's supposed to be. There is all of the space in the world for reconciliation, for healing, for restoration, but there is no faithful return to captivity. What Sola describes in her image isn't a household, and it's not a marriage. It's not even a prison, because at least a prison has, theoretically, a reason for existing. What Sola is describing is effectively a hell. It is so important for us to remember that Jesus Christ didn't come to earth to keep us bound, but to set us free, and to break open the gates of hell for all who believe, because in belief we find freedom. Bear in mind, this doesn't mean that divorce is good. It's definitely not. What it does mean is that adultery is really, really bad. The prohibition against adultery is, in fact, also setting out a course for us, for our married and our familial life, that is centered in a whole way of living, in love and in service and in care for one another. It's a partnership. We want to be on the same page. We want to be loving one another and helping one another out and not hurting one another. So that was very, very heavy, and these are supposed to be kind of fun videos, even if they are kind of super nerdy and academic. I want to leave on a slightly more optimistic note and a slightly more positive note. And to do that, I'm going to turn to our handy-dandy Bible. When we open our Bibles to Genesis 2, to the second creation story, we find the creation of human life and human society. While God created everything good, God found out that the first human was lonely and needed help. And thus, God split the original human into two parts. The man was named Adam, who came out from the earth. The woman that was made out of half of Adam was called Eve. And we find that when God split Adam and Eve apart, when God saw one and decided there should be two instead so that they could help one another out. We find the creation of new things. It's no longer just Adam as Adam was, but now there is an Ish and there's an Isha. There is a man and a woman. We might talk about this as the origin of sex and sexuality, but I think there's something a bit broader at work here and something a bit more important than that. Once again, I don't like it when things have no consequences, but rather when they have all the consequences, when we see the whole thing in the one. So what we actually find here, I think, is the creation of not just humanity and gender, but culture, family, authority, friendship, and so much more. You and I know that marriages and families, and indeed entire societies, look different based on where you are and when you are and what culture you're in. These things are always changing. There's no real consistent quote-unquote nuclear family that goes back to the beginning. But what we find consistent is that humans are never intended to be alone. You and I are meant to help, and we're meant to have helpers. People who will abide with you, and people who you can abide with. And in that abiding, find out a truer and deeper love. And in that abiding, find yourselves going deeper into the heart of God, and deeper into your understanding of what it means to be loved. Human beings are not a solitary species. We exist in community. We live in community. We're better in community. We're called to be with one another in a real way. We're called to reflect the light of God and to see another person reflecting the light of God. We're called to take part in this wonderful love. And marriage is a great way to express that. Not everyone's called to marriage, but I know that I'm glad that I'm married. And I hope that everyone who desires to be married, to have that kind of love and that kind of abiding in their lives, will get it when they're ready, when the time is right and the people are right. Life is called to be a blessing. There's no shortage of it, because we're in this together. In the end, this is about living well in community with one another. Respect and love the people you're with. Treat them as people whom Jesus Christ lived and died and rose for. In so doing, you're following the sixth commandment. Sex calls for mutual love, mutual trust, mutual consent, mutual protection, mutual commitment. We do these things together, and we can't take it lightly. It's an important act, and it deserves our intimacy and our full respect. And for that reason, we protect one another through the office of marriage. Take marriage seriously. Take living well seriously. And above all things, take your God and your neighbors seriously. Next week, we gather together again for our seventh commandment, you shall not steal.